Hi, this is Phil Cooke, and welcome to this episode of the Phil Cooke Podcast. We're going to be talking today with Jordan Loftis, who founded Story Chorus Publishing. He's a writer, ghostwriter, publisher, editor. He's got a team of people that do amazing work helping leaders get their story out in the form of a book. Now, a lot of people push back against ghostwriting and editors and helping people write things, particularly when it comes to pastors and ministry leaders. And I've addressed that in my book, Maximize Your Influence. There's a whole section in there about working with ghostwriters and why you need to do books and how that process works. But today, and I'd encourage you to get this, it'll answer a lot of your questions about not only publishing in today's digital age, but how to communicate your message on all platforms. But today we're going to talk to Jordan about his process of publishing, why you need to consider it. And it's going to be an interesting conversation. If you've ever thought about taking sermon material or presentation material or your life story, your origin story, whatever, turning it into a book, this is a episode you really have to hear. And if you know somebody that's struggling with that feels like they should write a book, they don't know where to start or how to get the project going, get this episode to them because they need to hear it. So let's stay tuned because we're going to have an interesting conversation with Jordan Loftis. Jordan, thank you so much for being a part of this episode. I've watched your work for a long time. We've worked with some similar leaders. And I just wanted to have you on the episode to talk about writing, editing, publishing, ghostwriting, all the stuff that leaders need to be concerned about today who want to get their story out. So welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, and I cannot wait to talk about it.
Well, let's go back and tell me a little bit about your story. You know, how did you get started in this thing? You were working for publishers. You're a writer yourself, a ghostwriter. Then you founded Story Chorus. Tell me a little bit about your history.
Yeah, the big moment for me was about 13 years ago. A friend and I started something called shortdailydevotions.com, still going today. We just started writing devotions. We started with 4 subscribers, his parents and my parents. And we just did it over the years just because we both love teaching the Bible. You know, I'm a church planter's kid. So just grew up valuing the church, loving the word. And that being a primary way where I just got so excited about it, had to tell people. And so we started writing these devotions. And 13 years later, what I realized is, I learned how to write. I learned how to figure out who the audience is. I learned how to build a list. I learned how to, do email marketing. So I started learning all these skills sort of on accident that you really need to know today, if you're going to be communicating with anyone online, but really at any level. If you've got a message to share, we need to be able to speak to a certain audience and then capture, that relationship. So we own it. So I accidentally got myself into that, built that writing habit. I've got crazy ADD, but I could write 150 words, so I just started with these small things. And then, as time went on, I got hired to do my very first book that I ghost wrote, and it was about foot health for an orthotics manufacturer.
Classic.
Listen, I can spell plantar fasciitis, but that's about as good as I can do. but that was the first time I got paid to write, and I was like, oh my goodness, this could actually help other people beyond me. And so since I've gotten to work on over 100 books and have ghostwritten over 60. But really, it all started with this desire to help people with words.
Now, you got your undergraduate degree in theology, right?
Correct. Yeah, theology and philosophy.
So you know the language of, the pastor speaks. You're particularly gifted to helping a pastor express himself or a ministry leader of some kind. So I think that's a really interesting thing. I got my PhD in theology because I've always been fascinated with it. And like you, I work in the ministry world. And so I think that's an important thing, to be able to talk the language of a pastor or a Christian leader. Have you found that to be so important with what you do?
Oh, 100%. Because, and this really brings us to the core of being a collaborative writer or a ghostwriter or whatever you want to look at, is because you are not a writer. You are a kind of an armor bearer to the communicator. So you need to be able to understand and speak their language, but also, particularly with pastors, you got to know what's their theological bent. Is this a Reformed guy? So we're going to be talking a lot about Martin Luther and the 95 Theses, right? Or is this someone with a different theological bent? And so we're going to, because certain words are really laden with a lot of lightning and meaning,
Right.
particularly, or how you'll want to handle. How are we handling Romans 9? Those kind of classic things.
Right.
You really will want the insight on that, but you also need a love for it and a love for the people that your author or, the communicator you're helping is serving. Otherwise, I think you're going to miss the heart of it, which is the most important part.
All right, now I want to jump right into the provocative part of this conversation, which is a lot of pastors and a lot of people generally have issues with the idea of a ghostwriter. A pastor, why should he hire a man or woman to come in and help him write his book when he's creating content to begin with? But the truth is, pastors are content machines, but they're not necessarily great writers. So, where do you stand on this? Because I know a lot of people, I've written a couple blog posts in defense of ghostwriters, and I've gotten a lot of flack for it. So what's your position on all this?
It was actually a hard thing for me to come to terms with in what I was doing. It was, you reach these existential moments.
Yeah.
And I even had to ask, well, how do I feel about this? And I came to learn there's really two different ways to look at ghostwriters. The first is that they're going to come in and they're going to get some general ideas, chat with the person, and then they're going to say, okay, well, I'm going to go write this book and then slap their name on it. And then the person says, oh, that's good enough. Okay, ship it. Some people do that. And I don't know anybody in the Christian sphere, pastors, leaders, whoever works with someone like that. Yeah. Never once have heard of that. I'm certainly not that way. And it's because you cannot separate the word in God's kingdom. You cannot separate the words from the author, from the speaker. When we look at, we don't add or remove from God's word. And when pastors are teaching, the words they use are very important. So they need to be their words. And case in point, Paul used what was called an amanuenses, which now we call ghostwriters. It literally was a servant at handwriting. And this is a super old way to write books. This is how books have been written for millennia. Is you'd have a leader with a nerd friend like me who'd come alongside of them, crawl up in their brain, understand what they wanted to say, what they wanted to do, what they wanted to accomplish, understand the people that they were trying to write to, and then from there be able to listen to them speak, probably take some really good shorthand notes, and then from there become an editor and a collaborative partner in it, just like I believe Tertius for the book of Romans with Paul. And so we actually have these people named at different points because you have someone who time matters a lot for leaders.
Yeah.
And so you have to ask, what is my best yes? Is my best yes sitting behind a computer for the average 300 to 500 hours it takes to write a 150-page book, or 1,000 hours if I'm writing something bigger? Is that my best yes as a matter of stewardship? Or would it be a better yes to say, I'm going to work with this person who I know gets my heart, gets my language and my words, understands the people I'm trying to write to, and then I'm going to talk, he's going to interview me, or however the situation works, and then I'm going to read it, but it's all coming from me. The interface by which I communicate and people read it, I just made an adjustment of how that process works. I brought an editor earlier on.
Now, do you work from sermon transcripts for maybe a series of messages?
Oh yeah, and we do this thing called pulpit to publish, and that's exactly what we love to do, because there are 25 years, right, of amazing messages. And so we can take that and you stay super faithful to those exact words because you're working off of transcripts. And so what you read would be about 95% of exactly what was said with some additions like, hey, you preached that in 1998. God's truth is timeless, so it still applies today.
Right.
But we probably should say something about the pandemic, or we should probably throw some stats in because what you said means even more today because we've seen that play out, right? And so that's just what a good editor does anyway. If you work with a good editor, they're going to try to make your content stronger. So they're going to suggest things. So that's really the function you have there is take a sermon transcript and bookify it by just peppering in some things that are more current or new, or this is the thing people don't think about a lot. And this is where pastors get stuck. And I get it. I speak all the time and have done a lot of preaching. When you are preaching and you have people there with you in the room, you do so much more nonverbal communication than you think. You do so much with inflection. There's so many things happening in a live connection with people or even video that does not translate to the page. Even certain jokes or illustrations, they're just not going to work. And so I've worked with a lot of pastors who are like, man, I have tried to turn this into a book and I could literally talk about this forever. And we've got people, there's 40,000 people that come to your church, but it's like, for some reason, I can't sit down and write this because I used this illustration with a backpack and I just can't get it to work in this chapter, right? All that kind of stuff. And so you can take those things and you can fix them and sort of Google Translate for a book versus a message. And that removes so much of the friction so you can get it into people's hands.
That's really interesting because, and it's true what you say. I've worked with hundreds of pastors over the years, and I don't think I know of anybody I've ever worked with that just had somebody write their book and just make it up. It's always based on a sermon transcript or a series of interviews or conversations or content that's been created for something else. It's always the pastor or the ministry leader's ideas and content, but just as, edited to make it much more readable, because there's a real difference between speaking and writing. And so I don't think people realize how big that difference is and how it needs to be adjusted when you're creating a book.
You don't realize it until you're looking at the cursor and trying not to curse. That's really what it is. And I think a perfect way to think of it is you, instead of sitting down to write, you're gonna speak it out instead of write it out. And one of the reasons this works, and here's the thing, Phil, even if someone doesn't want to go hire someone, but they want to write, but they keep getting stuck, interview yourself. You never get question answering block. People talk about writer's block, but you'll never get question answering block. That's why it works, because you can answer questions forever. And so even rephrasing things as questions to yourself to answer can get you unstuck, and talking to your voice memo and then upload it to some AI thing and get it transcripted. There's you changing the interface between you and getting words on a page can make all the difference in the world, because it's still you. It's just getting there a lot faster.
Okay, so you founded Story Chorus, your company,
Yes.
and give me a little idea of the process. If I'm a ministry leader, a business executive, a pastor, whatever, and I want to engage you guys to do a book, give me a typical. I know every situation's different, but give me an idea of what the process is like.
Yeah, so I'm actually wearing this shirt right now that says Story Print with a big, thumbprint design on it. But that's really our foundational principle: is everyone has a story print, just like God gave you a fingerprint. No two are the same, right?
Yeah, that's true.
It's the same with our story. In business, your story is your greatest competitive advantage because it's the only thing nobody has. But in the kingdom, our story is actually a weapon. Revelation 12:11, they overcame the enemy by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, for they love not their lives even unto death. And when you think about that, our story and testimony of what God has done for us and is doing through us, that's lined up right next to the blood of Jesus. I get goosebumps right now thinking about that. And so when we approach writing a book, it works in the marketplace. It works for our mission. When we focus on your story, it becomes the perfect backdrop by which to share a message that might seem like, man, well, a million other people have talked about this, but not on the backdrop of your story, because that's the canvas upon which people paint their futures, because they can see their story in yours. So we start with this story printing process with our authors, whether they're pastors or whoever, even if they're doing a sermon series that we're going to turn into it, because it really helps understand, well, hey, what's unique? We call it You Inc. You are a brand. What is your story? But then we want to map it out all the way from idea to impact. So in the business world and in the nonprofit world, what's the ROI? What is the return on impact or the return on investment? And we say impact and income are the two wings to every plane. So what do we want to see happen in people's lives? And what do we want to see happen, financially? Because we even know, heck, money moves the kingdom forward. And so we do pro bono projects. We do them with nonprofits, and they're excellent fundraising tools, right? So there's so many different things. But before we even start writing a word, we want to start with your story print. So we know not even what is going to go into the book, but we also know who it's for, because the who drives the what. And we know what this little book needs to do in the world, or this big book, if you want to write a camel choker like we read in college,
Yep.
But we have a job description for this thing. So we know what it should accomplish. And that's the first part of our process. It's called SWIFT, publish. S is for story print, which is really that strategic work. And then W, that's where you hang out with me or someone on my team. And we talk a lot and we get to know each other pretty well, but we interview you all through your story and in your content, whatever that is. We work on outlining it and blah, blah, blah. But we sit and you speak it out for usually 3 to 4 days if it's a full book. And then we've got a great book brand team for designing, which is the I, it's imagery, flight. Let's get this baby launched on time and in the right direction, helping you get it out into the world. And then T, and this is the part where I think a lot of publishing stops short of, it's the traction word. So SWIFT, it ends with traction, because you have to get traction with your message in order for it to make its long-term impact, because a book should have a compounding effect. It gets more and more important with each passing year because of the message it's laden with. But what is that path to traction? Because it's a noisier world than ever. We know that next year, 6 million books will get published. And now with AI, we're probably going to see that do the same thing Moore's Law does. And, with computing power. And we're going to see more and more content than ever just get shot out into the world. And so that's where being really strategic about who you're serving, and then really focusing on now, how does this get purchase and traction and actually make the difference? Those two things, you can't just write a great book anymore. You have to have an excellent strategic package around it, or the little soldier ain't going to do the work.
Well, for people listening or watching, it's important to know that the publishing world has changed.
Yes.
My first few books were published by major publishers, HarperCollins, Thomas Nelson, Baker Books, people like that. And my last 2 books, I self-published, or we call it hybrid publishing, because essentially, I discovered over the years that publishers, even big ones, don't lift a finger to help me market the book. It's almost if I don't even know why they publish it to begin with, if they're going to be such a no help when it comes to marketing the book. So I figured if I'm going to have to market it myself, I might as well own the rights. I might as well be in control of this whole thing and do it myself. And that's kind of where you're coming from, that most pastors, most leaders out there are not going to get a big deal from a major publisher. You've got to have a big you've got to bring a big following to the table for a major publisher to be interested. So I think I've always recommended for the last number of years that the best way to do this is let's just do it ourselves. Publishing is kind of going through what the music industry went through 10 years ago.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Yeah. So my daughter's a musician in Brooklyn. She's doing her own stuff. She's publishing. I mean, she's recording her own stuff. She's publishing it herself. She's getting it on Spotify. It's just we have to be the driver of anything we do in the world today if we're going to be successful. I think your model is a really solid model for somebody who has a story they want to tell.
I appreciate it. And the first thing is, I know a lot of people in traditional publishing, and there are really great people, and there's a lot of great people doing really great work. I think you illustrated a couple of the problems is number one, it's the deals are based on things that used to happen a long time ago. So we've got a lot of things being brought into today that are actually no longer barriers for people. So I call our model strategic publishing, but it's very similar to what you're talking about with hybrid publishing, where, hey, I hire people from who used to work in the big fives, I won't say any of the names, but thank you for getting them ready. But what we're able to do is we're able to work leaner, faster, and give a lot more creative control to the author. Because my philosophy is not that you are here playing on our team and we're going to tell you what to do. We're going to tell you what the title is. We're going to tell you what the cover looks like. We're going to, we're going to tell you, hey, this is too short, so we need to add another chapter so that you're not in the wrong category in the bookstore, right?
Yeah.
Those kind of things. We're not going to make you do that, because as the author, your people. We're going to do everything we can to make this the best book possible, but you are the expert in your audience. You are the expert at helping the people that you've helped with whatever your venue is. So let's put you in the driver's seat, and also not ask you to just take 12.5% of book sales ongoing after doing all the blood, sweat, and tears yourself.
That's a great way to put it. And you bring everybody to the table. You're bringing the cover designer to the table. You're bringing the page design to the table. You're doing it all.
Yeah. And then we've got a great marketing engine on the back end, because if you imagine two concentric circles where there's a little dot in the middle and then there's a big one, the big one is marketing. That's 80% of the work, and writing a great book, which is so hard to do, is 20% of the work, right? So anything you do has to have a really good marketing strategy behind it. And that's simply because people talk about attention spans being lower and being quicker. What you really need to think about, it's not that attention spans are lower as much as our threshold for what we'll give our attention to is much higher. Nobody has a hard time binge watching 9 hours of their favorite show on Netflix. We've got great attention spans for things that are worth paying attention to. And so what our first work is letting people know this is worth your attention, because that's the first sale everyone's got to make. Yeah. And that's why the traction idea and the marketing idea is really important, so that you know how to communicate. Listen, this is worth more than binge watching, 10 hours of CSI or whatever your thing is.
Right. So how do we get in touch with you? How do we find out more information about Story Chorus and about the new story print process that you go through? How do we find out about Jordan Loftis?
So you can go to storychorus.com. That's where you'll find all of our stuff, and you can see some of our books and get a feel for what we offer. But more importantly, you can go to mystoryprint.com, and that's where you're going to find a lot of free resources. I just did a new guide called Unleash Your Authentic Voice. It's about how to become unforgettable using the power of your origin story. So I give you a full origin story script, exactly how to tell your story in certain contexts so that no one ever forgets your message. So we've got a ton of stuff that we're just giving away for free to make sure that you can excel in the attention economy. So
let me just say that origin story concept is so important. It's funny. I've talked before on this podcast about the fact that with collectible comic books, for instance, the most valuable, if you look at the, auction prices, the most valuable are always origin stories. How Iron Man got started, how Batman got started, how Wonder Woman got started. People are fascinated with origin stories. And I've translated that with many major ministries over the years and churches over the years to how a pastor was called into ministry, how he got started, where he came from, what his background is. That is so incredibly important because people are really fascinated with, even people that would think, I didn't lead a very exciting life. I don't have a great origin story, but you know what? I think there's somebody out there that needs to hear your story. And so I just agree with you 100% that figuring out that origin story is really critical.
Absolutely. And, there's a reason why Matthew starts with the genealogy of Jesus, right? There's a reason why we get all those generations that might seem a little boring to us, but you dig into it and you realize that Jesus was coming for a long, long time and God had been setting this thing up. And that's exactly what your origin story is. It's the setup to the purpose and the impact that you're called to make that people are going to find a lot more interesting than you think. And the origin story script is just going to help you make sure you hit the right notes so that you also skip the grandpa version, telling all the extraneous details that maybe aren't so important.
Yeah. And to emphasize something you mentioned earlier, and I think this is so important. Yes, there are a lot of pastors out there, but there's no other pastor with your origin story, with your background, with your history, the family you came from, where you're from. I mean, the minute you cultivate or combine your calling with your past, you become unique. I don't care what you do, what kind of leader you are, business leader, ministry leader, filmmaker, musician, whatever. Figuring out who you are and what you've come from and what your past is all about makes you instantly absolutely unique. Nobody else has your past. Nobody else has your origin story. So for those of you thinking, what, nobody wants to hear from me, I'm like a million other pastors or a million other leaders or a million other business guys, it doesn't matter. Your origin story makes you absolutely unique. And so I think you are totally on the right track. And I think people need to look into this even more.
Hey, I appreciate it. And yeah, I always say lead with your life, not with your logo, because that is the magic.
That's good. That's good. All right, man. Well, listen, thank you for coming on. If you're going to leave people with one thought about why they need to get their story into a book form, what would you say?
Your primary job is to steward the work God has called you to and is also doing through you. And from my perspective, there's no better work you can do than steward God's story as told through your life. If you go to Joshua 4 and you see they cross over, what do they build after crossing over the Jordan? An altar of remembrance. And why? So that when your children ask you, you can tell them, this is God bringing us out of Egypt. This is the Exodus story. And so what I want you to understand is that coming generations depend on your story because your story is part of God's saga, God's rescue mission of bringing people to Jesus. And Gen Z and the generations beyond, they need all of us to share what God's been doing because our identity comes from story. That's why we say the story over and over. I live to tell the story. That's why we do that. So when we're quiet, generations in the future will suffer. So we have to do our part of not letting that happen.
Very well said. Thanks for being on the podcast. And we may do this again soon because this is a really fascinating conversation. I think more leaders need to hear it.
Thanks so much. Absolutely loved it. Appreciate you, Phil.
And remember, I talk a lot about this stuff here in my book, Maximize Your Influence, How to Make Digital Media Work for Your Church, Your Ministry, and You. This is so important. How we get our ideas out there in a book form is so critical. And I think you should look at Jordan's material. We're putting all the information in the show notes. And go to his website, check it out. I just think his story print concept is important. How to develop your origin story. I've talked about that a lot, that, you know what, your story, your personal story is what makes you unique. I don't care how many filmmakers there are, or pastors there are, or business leaders there are, or teachers or coaches, whatever. your past, your history, your origin story makes you unique. And it's worth thinking about, maybe I need to tell my story in a book form. Future generations need to hear what God's done with your life and what you've accomplished. I think it's so very important. So thanks for tuning in. Go to my website, philcooke.com, Cook with an E. Find out what I'm doing and what we're talking about and what I'm writing about during the week. Love to have you go subscribe to my newsletter. You can see the little box in the upper right-hand corner of my website. Subscribe to my newsletter. It's a weekly free newsletter, and you'll just get the top 5 stories I write every week sent to your email inbox. Save you a lot of time and a lot of trouble. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.